There was a certain calm to the village of Lower Ivycombe in early June, a calm so complete it might have lulled even the most restless of souls into contentment. Roses clambered over trellises, bees hummed industriously in neatly trimmed hedgerows, and the clink of teacups drifted lazily through the air like the scent of honeysuckle. It was, by all appearances, the sort of village where nothing ever happened. And that, of course, was precisely why Miss Marple always paid such close attention. The evening in question was one of those long English twilights when the sky faded not into darkness, but into a soft, silvery blue. The village was attending the annual Midsummer Charity Garden Supper, held as always in the grounds of the ancient Marchwood Hall, home to the eccentric and ever so slightly theatrical Lady Agnes Marchwood. Miss Marple, seated beneath a festoon of paper lanterns, accepted her glass of elderflower cordial with quiet thanks and cast her eyes over the gathering. There were, to her mind, few things as revealing as a garden party. The way people mingled, or didn't. Who arrived with whom. Whose gaze lingered too long, or not long enough. "Now really, Agnes, you've outdone yourself," declared Colonel Denham, all mustache and medals. "These prawns are something else." "They're not prawns, they're river crayfish, Denham," Lady Agnes replied with the sort of patient condescension that only the upper crust can deliver. "Caught just this morning by young Hugh Grinstead. He does adore a net." "Useful boy," muttered the Colonel, popping another into his mouth. From her position by the tea-urn, Miss Marple observed the younger Grinstead in question. Hugh, son of the late Canon Grinstead, was a quiet, introspective young man with a fondness for rare orchids and an unfortunate stammer when forced to converse. He stood near the hedge, awkwardly holding a plate of pork pie while making no effort whatsoever to speak to anyone. Beside him, rather unfortunately for his peace of mind, stood Clara Pierce, the vicar's niece, a striking young woman recently returned from the continent, possessed of a sharp tongue and the air of someone far too worldly for a village supper. The two made an odd pair, and Miss Marple filed it away with the same mental neatness as her sewing-pins. Then, as twilight deepened, Lady Agnes rose to deliver her annual speech, part thank you, part nostalgia, and entirely too long. "We gather here beneath the stars," she began grandly, "to support our dear Lower Ivycombe Library, and to celebrate the beauty of our community." There was polite applause, a dropped fork, and a discreet cough from the vicar. Lady Agnes, undeterred, pressed on. "Tonight, you shall all be permitted a moonlit stroll through the walled garden. Yes, even you, Mr. Tibbs," she added, wagging a finger at the local solicitor. "It's newly restored, and best seen under silver light." At this, a murmur of interest passed through the crowd. The walled garden of Marchwood Hall had been sealed off for nearly 2 decades, ever since the death of Lord Marchwood and a curious incident involving a poisoned greenhouse. Rumor had it the place was haunted, though in Lower Ivycombe, such stories were less about ghosts than they were about memories people chose not to revisit. Miss Marple remained seated as the guests began to trickle toward the arched stone gate that led to the garden. Her knees were not quite what they once were, and besides, she found it more useful to observe those going in than to follow. She watched as Hugh Grinstead hesitated at the threshold, then followed Clara after a moment's encouragement. She watched as Colonel Denham and Mrs. Beatrice Harroway, whose husband was conspicuously absent, slipped in behind them. Lady Agnes took the arm of Dr. Redfern, whose interest in botany rivaled only his interest in gossip. Nearly 20 guests passed through the gate. Laughter drifted back. Then music, soft and eerie, played on someone's gramophone near the rose trellis. And then, a scream. High, piercing, and unmistakably real. The party froze. Miss Marple stood, one hand steadying herself on the table. By the time she reached the entrance of the walled garden, a small crowd had gathered, their faces pale in the moonlight. Clara Pierce stood near the sundial, trembling violently, her fingers bloodied. At her feet lay the still body of Hugh Grinstead. The village of Lower Ivycombe, it seemed, would not sleep peacefully tonight. The body was removed before dawn. Dr. Redfern had declared it instantaneous, with all the grim finality expected of a country physician. The cause, he said, was trauma to the skull, blunt force, swift and decisive. No chance of accident, no time for calling out. Hugh Grinstead had died within seconds, beneath the sheltering boughs of the moonlit willow tree. It was Clara Pierce who had found him, or rather, who had stumbled across him. She was still trembling when she was taken home by her uncle, the Reverend. Her delicate shoes had been soaked in dew, her white shawl streaked with crimson. Several guests swore they'd heard her gasp just before the scream. "She didn't find him," muttered Mrs. Harroway the next morning at the greengrocer's. "She led him there. You mark my words." Mr. Tibbs, standing behind her, made a polite noise of disagreement. "I rather think she's more shocked than anything else. Terrible business. That boy wouldn't hurt a fly." Mrs. Harroway sniffed. "You've clearly never seen Hugh in a temper." "I have. Once, at the post office, when they lost one of his precious orchid clippings. Went quite red in the face." "But hardly grounds for murder," said Mr. Tibbs dryly. All through Lower Ivycombe, the speculation churned. By tea-time, it was widely believed that Hugh Grinstead had been in love with Clara and that she, being naturally flighty and cosmopolitan, had rejected him cruelly. By supper-time, the story had evolved. She had not rejected him but accepted his affections only to later spurn him for someone better placed. And by the following morning, there were whispers that Clara had been seen with Colonel Denham, though precisely what they had been seen doing was never stated outright, only implied with raised eyebrows and pursed lips. Miss Marple listened to all of it with the faintest smile and a steady hand as she folded her linens. It was not that she discounted gossip, quite the opposite. Gossip, properly interpreted, was as useful a tool as any fingerprint. But one had to know how to listen, to sift the true wheat of human behavior from the chaff of self-importance and bias. She had noted several curious things the night before. Firstly, that Clara's scream had not come immediately after the gramophone music ceased, but rather some time later, after the garden had fallen again into silence. Secondly, that Lady Agnes, for all her usual theatricality, had grown unusually quiet after hearing it. And thirdly, and this she found most telling, that the blood on Clara's shawl had been smeared, not splattered. She had also observed, with her usual unassuming gaze, that the willow tree beneath which Hugh had been found was partially obscured from the main footpath by a thick hedge of lilac. That sort of privacy was not stumbled upon. It was chosen. Inspector Graves arrived from Market Chilling late that afternoon. A tall, self-important man with a salt-and-pepper mustache and a fondness for writing in large, authoritative loops, he was every inch the sort of official who saw murder as a puzzle best solved by tidying up all the obvious pieces. "I shall require statements from every guest," he informed Lady Agnes, whose expression suggested she would rather have hosted a plague than a murder. "And I would ask that the garden remain cordoned off until I give the all-clear." Lady Agnes gave a tight nod. "I will speak to my staff. I assume you have no objection to Miss Marple remaining? She's a friend of the family and has already been most helpful." Graves turned and regarded the elderly lady in her powder-blue cardigan and rose-embroidered hat. "I've heard of Miss Marple," he said slowly. "You're the one who solved that poison case in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple gave a modest smile. "It was only a matter of noticing who refilled the sugar bowl, Inspector. Nothing so clever." "Even so." He paused, clearly uncertain how to treat her. Eventually, he settled on a sort of forced gallantry. "Well, I don't suppose you saw anything that would be helpful in this case?" "I'm afraid not," Miss Marple said sweetly. "Only that grief comes in many forms, and not all of them produce tears." The inspector blinked, opened his notebook, and politely moved on. Later that evening, Miss Marple took her usual slow walk through the village lanes. She passed the vicarage, where a candle still burned in the upstairs window. No doubt Clara was awake, caught between shock and guilt, whether earned or not. She passed the shop front, where Mrs. Harroway's husband's name was still printed on the window. C. Harroway, tailor and haberdasher, though Mr. Harroway himself had not been seen in some months, allegedly away visiting a cousin in Kent. Miss Marple had her doubts. And then she reached the edge of Marchwood Hall, where the garden gate stood closed, a length of twine now looped through the latch. She paused, gaze resting on the garden wall. Ivy clung to the old stones like gossip clung to the villagers, rooted deep, spreading wide, and hard to pull away cleanly. Hugh Grinstead had died suddenly, yes. But nothing in Lower Ivycombe was sudden. Everything came from somewhere, some slow burn of resentment or misunderstanding or long-nursed pain. And as she turned to walk back to her lodgings, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. Someone had chosen the moonlit garden, and she meant to know why. By the following morning, Lower Ivycombe had returned, at least outwardly, to its usual rhythms. The birds sang, the milk was delivered, and the church bell tolled for matins with its customary slow dignity. But inside the homes, parlors, and shops, things were not as they had been. There was something brittle about the smiles, something watchful in the glances exchanged. Conversations died abruptly when certain names were mentioned, and hands lingered too long on teacups when Inspector Graves passed by with his notebook. At the edge of the green, the vicarage shutters remained drawn. Miss Marple, always an early riser, had already taken her morning walk and was sitting quietly in the corner of the tea shop, sipping a cup of strong Darjeeling and taking delicate bites of a currant bun. Mrs. Penelope Cross, the shop's proprietor and an inveterate source of both biscuits and information, lingered by the counter. "Such a dreadful thing," she said in a low voice, glancing to see who might be within earshot. "Poor young Hugh. So gentle, really. Not quite right for the world, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Some souls are like that. Too sensitive, and yet misunderstood for it." "Clara's still not come out," Mrs. Cross continued. "The vicar sent word through the verger. She won't see anyone. She leaned in. And they say she and Hugh were, well, involved." "That does seem to be the popular notion," Miss Marple replied, folding her napkin precisely. Mrs. Cross looked over her shoulder, then said in a hushed tone, "But I wonder, you know, if it wasn't someone else entirely. I saw Mrs. Harroway leaving the garden not 5 minutes before Clara screamed. Alone. Looking very pale." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Oh." Mrs. Cross nodded eagerly. "And there's that husband of hers. Still conveniently off in Kent. But no one's spoken to him. Not even a letter. Seems rather odd, don't you think?" "Curious indeed," Miss Marple murmured. Outside the window, a figure hurried past, scarf fluttering, Mr. Tibbs, the solicitor, heading toward the post office with his usual nervous energy. A discreet man, Mr. Tibbs rarely made waves, but Miss Marple had noted a distinct twitchiness about him since the night of the supper. The sort of twitchiness that came not from grief, but from anticipation. She finished her tea and rose. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, had settled himself in Lady Agnes Marchwood's study and was methodically working his way through a list of supper guests. Lady Agnes, for her part, sat stiffly on the chaise, her lace gloves clutched in one hand and her mouth set in a line that suggested she rather wished Graves would disappear into the hedgerow. "I understand you and Mr. Grinstead were quite close," the inspector said, not unkindly. Lady Agnes raised an eyebrow. "He was a boy, Inspector. A clever one, yes, with rather too much intensity and far too little social grace, but no more than a project. I encouraged his horticultural talents." "Did he ever show signs of distress? Any quarrels? Bitterness?" "Don't be absurd," she said with a huff. "Hugh's troubles were of the soul, not the temper. And as for bitterness, well, what young man isn't afflicted with a touch of it now and then?" Graves made a note, then said, "Several guests mentioned seeing you near the gate just before the scream. Did you hear anything? A voice, perhaps?" Lady Agnes's eyes flickered. "Only the music. I was speaking with Dr. Redfern at the time." "Could he verify that?" She hesitated. "I imagine so. Was your conversation of a private nature?" Lady Agnes's nostrils flared. "Inspector, I am not in the habit of being interrogated like a barmaid in a brothel." Graves smiled politely. "Even so, your recollections may be crucial." She rose. "Then I suggest you ask Dr. Redfern." As she swept from the room, Miss Marple appeared in the hall, hat neatly pinned and handbag primly at her side. Lady Agnes paused. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, "if you're here to join the chorus of speculation, I assure you—" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple with a smile. "I find speculation so often gets in the way of observation. I merely thought it might be helpful to see the garden in the daylight." Lady Agnes blinked. "Of course. Yes. The gate's still open." The walled garden in daylight was something else entirely. Gone was the soft glamour of paper lanterns and candlelight. Now it was stark, though still lovely, in the early sun, with dew glittering on the lily leaves and the stone sundial casting its sharp shadow across the gravel path. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes never still. She paused at the willow tree where Hugh had been found. A dark patch remained in the soil, hastily covered with fresh earth. A low branch, cracked and dangling, caught her eye. She walked to it and, with delicate care, examined the splintered wood. A heavy object had struck it from above, or else a person had gripped it too tightly. She noted the fibers, frayed on one side. Not a fatal observation, perhaps, but interesting. She turned to the lilac hedge. Part of it was still bent, as though someone had passed through in haste, not along the neat gravel path, but behind it. A shortcut, or an escape. She crouched, peering at the base. A scrap of fabric lay nestled among the roots, silk, cream-colored, and torn at the edge. She did not touch it. Instead, she smiled to herself, as one might when an old pattern began to re-emerge in familiar stitching. And then, slowly, she turned her gaze upward toward the house. The study window was slightly ajar. From it, one could just see the corner of the willow. Someone had watched. Or waited. She stood, dusted her gloves, and walked calmly back to the gate. There was a great deal to unravel. And if she was correct, the next knot would appear very soon. The morning service at St. Mildred's was unusually crowded for a Thursday. Reverend Pierce's voice echoed from the pulpit with its usual calm cadences, but there was a tension in the pews, a restlessness in the air. Clara did not attend. Miss Marple sat quietly 2 rows from the back, her hymnal open though she made no pretense of singing. Her pale eyes drifted subtly from one villager to another. Lady Agnes, composed and gloved, flanked by her companion Miss Everleigh, Dr. Redfern, blinking more than usual behind his spectacles, and at the far end, seated alone and still as a marble effigy, sat Mr. Julian Tibbs. He did not look grief-stricken, nor angry, nor even curious. He looked numb. After the final hymn, the villagers filed out, whispering condolences and pleasantries in equal measure. Graves stood near the churchyard gate, nodding to each passer-by with a look of heavy obligation, his notebook hidden but, no doubt, always within reach. "Miss Marple," he said, intercepting her with a polite tip of his hat. "You've had a walk through the garden, I'm told?" "Yes," she replied mildly. "Quite a tranquil place, really, apart from the murder." Graves gave a tight smile. "Tranquility and blood don't often mix. Find anything curious?" "Oh, several things," she said airily. "But I suppose they'd seem quite unremarkable. It's all in the pattern, you know." Graves raised an eyebrow. "You sound like you already have a theory." "I don't need one yet," she said. "The truth, I've found, tends to announce itself when people begin forgetting the lies they've told." He gave a soft grunt and let her pass. It was just after midday when Julian Tibbs received a visitor at his office. Miss Marple stepped inside, removing her gloves with delicate precision. "I do hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I simply thought you might appreciate a bit of company." Tibbs blinked up from behind his desk. The office smelled faintly of old leather and lavender wax polish, and a tray of untouched sandwiches sat near his elbow. "Miss Marple," he said after a pause, "forgive me. My mind's been somewhere else." "Perfectly understandable. Death tends to shake the soil a bit, doesn't it?" Tibbs gave a hollow chuckle. "Quite." She sat opposite him, hands folded neatly in her lap. "You and Hugh Grinstead were friends, I understand?" Tibbs hesitated. "We were acquainted. He handled some of Lady Agnes's affairs with me. Investments, mostly." "Such matters require a great deal of trust," she said gently. "They do." His brow furrowed. "I didn't always agree with his ideas. He had an idealist streak, too generous to be practical. But he meant well." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You don't seem terribly shocked by his death." Tibbs looked at her sharply. Of course I am. But I suppose shock wears differently on different people." "Indeed. Some weep. Some retreat. And some," she leaned forward slightly, "forget to weep altogether." He looked away. "I don't know what you're implying." "Nothing at all," she said with a soft smile. "Only that grief can be very revealing when it doesn't behave the way others expect." He gave no reply. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "One last thing, Mr. Tibbs. The night of the garden party, did you happen to see Lady Agnes speaking to Hugh?" Tibbs hesitated. "No. But I did see her with Dr. Redfern, near the West Path. They seemed tense." "Ah," she said. "How very interesting." By the time the sun began to dip behind the cottages, casting long shadows across the green, Miss Marple had already made 2 further calls, one brief, one not. The brief call was to Clara Pierce. The girl answered the door herself, her face pale and her voice low. "Miss Marple, I don't think I can talk about it just yet." "I quite understand, my dear. I only wondered, did you happen to see who had been standing near the lilac hedge before you found Hugh?" Clara blinked. "No. I just remember the music stopping. Then it was quiet, and I thought I heard something like a sob." "A sob?" Miss Marple echoed gently. She nodded. "Not loud, but strange. As if someone had been crying but didn't want to be heard." Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. "Thank you, Clara. That's very helpful." The longer visit was to Dr. Redfern. He met her at the surgery with his usual briskness, spectacles perched halfway down his nose, his desk still cluttered with folders and an untouched bowl of porridge from breakfast. "I can give you 5 minutes, Miss Marple," he said. "I'm afraid I'm rather inundated." "Of course," she said, lowering herself into the patient's chair. "I only wanted to ask about something you said at the garden party." He frowned. "Did I?" "You remarked to Lady Agnes, within earshot of several guests, that Hugh Grinstead had become a man of secrets. I wondered what you meant." Redfern rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It was careless of me to say that, but true, I think. Hugh had changed over the past few weeks. Distracted. Worried. About what, do you think?" "I don't know. But I did hear him arguing with someone 2 days before the party. Outside the library window." "Did you recognize the voice?" He hesitated. "It was a man. Older. And angry." "Not Mr. Tibbs?" "No. Deeper voice. And I don't believe Tibbs would threaten anyone." She rose. "Thank you, Doctor. I know how busy you are." As she stepped into the late afternoon, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. An unwept grief. A quiet sob by the hedge. A man of secrets, and another too calm to have lost a friend. Yes, she thought. The garden had not been silent after all. It was Miss Everleigh, Lady Agnes's companion of 17 years, who first mentioned the letter. She did so not in confession, nor with any hint of scandal, but rather as a kind of absent-minded footnote, as she was dusting the porcelain cat figurines in the morning drawing-room and chatting with Miss Marple, who had come for a harmless neighborly call. "I can't say I ever much liked Mr. Grinstead," Miss Everleigh said, polishing a Wedgwood plate with elaborate care. "Far too intense. Always asking questions no one wanted to answer. And always scribbling things down in that little notebook." "Notebook?" Miss Marple echoed gently, from her chair near the window. "Oh, yes," said Miss Everleigh. "He carried it everywhere. Leather-bound. Maroon, I believe. He said he wrote letters to himself in it, instead of speaking aloud, though one wonders if he might have done both." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And was that notebook found with him?" Miss Everleigh paused, cloth still in hand. "Well, no, now that you mention it. I should think it wasn't." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. Miss Everleigh resumed dusting. "And there was a letter, too. A real one. Or meant to be. Left it with the butler, I think. Told him to post it in the evening. Only he never did. What was his name again?" "Mr. Temple," Miss Marple offered. "Yes, that's it. He said he never found the time. Of all the days to neglect the post." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Do you know to whom the letter was addressed?" Miss Everleigh frowned. "No. But I remember seeing the envelope on the side table. Hugh had written the address in his usual scrawl, just the name, no more. And the name, well," she tapped the cloth against the china for emphasis. "It was Julian Tibbs." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the post office. It was not uncommon for her to make such appearances. She had a long-standing fondness for writing letters to distant cousins and nieces, though few of them ever replied. But on this occasion, She was not here to send correspondence, only to ask a few harmless, grandmotherly questions. Miss Davis, the postmistress, was young and fond of chatting. "Oh yes, I remember Mr. Grinstead bringing something in," she said brightly. "It wasn't the post, though. He came to buy paper and envelopes, one of those nice cream ones, you know. Said he had something important to get off his chest." Miss Marple tilted her head. "He used that phrase." "Exactly that. Bit dramatic, wasn't it? But he seemed anxious. Not frightened, just very serious. Odd for him." "Did he mention the recipient?" "No, but he did scribble something in a notebook after he paid. Maroon cover. Quite worn at the corners." Miss Marple nodded, more to herself than anyone else. By twilight, Lower Ivycombe was settling into a restless quiet. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual. Conversations turned hushed when footsteps passed the window. The garden party, which had once promised a break from village monotony, now lingered like a bad dream no one wished to revisit. Miss Marple, however, remained at her parlour window, sewing basket beside her and eyes on the lane. She wasn't waiting long. Julian Tibbs, briefcase clutched under one arm, stepped briskly from his front gate and turned east, towards the woods, not the village square. Odd, she thought. That path led nowhere but the orchard and a small summer-house long fallen out of use. Miss Marple rose, fetched her shawl, and followed. The summer-house lay at the edge of Marchwood Orchard, half swallowed by ivy and neglect. Once painted white, its frame had faded to grey, its roof bowed slightly with age. It had not been used since the war, when it had served briefly as a place for convalescing officers. Miss Marple approached without sound. Inside, through the broken window slats, she saw Tibbs. He was standing by the old bench, head bowed, hands clenched. Something lay on the bench, dark and square. A notebook. He opened it, flipped pages. Then, after a pause, he took out a match. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Forgive me," she said, in her gentlest tone, "but destroying evidence is rarely a sign of innocence, Mr. Tibbs." He turned sharply. The match dropped, unlit. How long have you been?" "Oh, just now," she said, stepping inside. "But long enough to realize that whatever is in that book, you did not want it read." Tibbs looked down. "It's not what you think." "No." Her voice remained kind. "Then do tell me." He sat heavily. "He wrote about all of us, you know. Everyone. He watched people. Wrote about things he noticed. Things he suspected." Miss Marple nodded. "He was not always wrong, I expect." "No," Tibbs admitted. "But he lacked discretion. He thought secrets were things to be unearthed, not protected." "Did he write about you?" Tibbs hesitated. "Yes. Something I told him in confidence. Years ago. About, well, my father. A shameful debt. And you feared it might come to light. I asked him to tear it out. He refused. Said he was writing his truth, and that if anyone was hurt by it, that was proof the truth mattered." Miss Marple looked at him closely. "And so you followed him into the garden that night?" Tibbs looked up. "No, I didn't. I swear. I argued with him the day before, but I left it at that. Yet you came here to destroy his notebook." I only found it this morning. It was hidden behind the altar in the church." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Why take it here?" Tibbs gave a small, bitter laugh. "Because I was too much a coward to burn it at home." She said nothing. After a long silence, he handed her the notebook. "If it helps solve his murder," he said quietly, "then let the truth be read." Back in her sitting-room, Miss Marple lit a lamp and began turning the pages of Hugh Grinstead's final journal. The entries were neat, dense, and quietly devastating. He had written of Clara, her sadness, her isolation; of Lady Agnes, her thinly veiled manipulation of village affairs; of Dr. Redfern's long-ago heartbreak and his slowly eroding ethics; of Julian Tibbs's shame; of Miss Everleigh's secret inheritance. And, in one passage, dated 2 days before his death, he wrote, "Someone knows. The roses in the orchard are not what they seem. If I am right, there will be a reckoning. But truth, once planted, must grow." Miss Marple read that line twice. Then she closed the book, folded her hands, and said aloud, "Now it begins." By the following morning, the skies above Lower Ivycombe had turned a dismal pewter. Rain threatened but did not fall, and the air carried a heaviness that seemed to press down on the village's shoulders. In the snug parlour of St. Mary Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat with a maroon notebook open once more, reading not for gossip or curiosity, but for motive. She had always believed that one could learn far more from what people feared than from what they confessed. And Mr. Hugh Grinstead, for all his good manners and generous smiles, had clearly known too much. The final entry still lingered in her mind: "The roses in the orchard are not what they seem." Curious indeed, especially since Lower Ivycombe had no known orchard roses in bloom at this time of year, except the small, neglected patch near the edge of Marchwood Orchard, just behind the summer-house. Miss Marple had passed it before. She remembered it well. It had been planted long ago, rumored to have once belonged to a lady of the manor whose name had since vanished into history. Pale pink, almost white, and wild now, untamed and left to fend for themselves among the brambles. Yet if Hugh Grinstead had referred to them so cryptically, perhaps they were no mere flora at all. She made up her mind. By mid-morning, wrapped in her grey shawl, she walked briskly to the orchard. The roses were still there, drooping under the weight of damp air, their petals thin and ghostly. The patch was enclosed by a low iron fence, long rusted, and overgrown with ivy. It was not well trodden, and only someone truly curious or determined might have reason to notice it at all. Miss Marple knelt beside the fence, hands steady despite her age. She brushed back some ivy trailing along the base, revealing a small depression in the soil, as though someone had dug there recently and poorly covered it. With a small garden trowel retrieved from her handbag, a habit she'd picked up long ago during her amateur archaeology days, she began to scoop gently. It didn't take long. Only 2 inches below the surface lay a small metal box, the kind once used for keepsakes or coins. Miss Marple lifted it with care, brushing away the clinging dirt. Inside was a single object: a broken brooch. It was an odd piece, delicate, shaped like a crescent moon, with small embedded opals and a fine gold pin that had snapped in two. She recognized it. It had belonged to Clara Pierce. Or rather, to her mother. The memory returned at once. An old conversation at the village fete 2 years prior, when Clara, still mourning her mother's passing, had worn the brooch on her coat and told Miss Marple, "It's the only thing I have left of her, besides memories and an awful habit of over-watering geraniums." And now here it lay, broken and hidden beneath the roses. Miss Marple stood for a moment, heart beating a little faster. Had Clara dropped it? Or had someone taken it? Either explanation troubled her. She placed the brooch back in the box and returned it to her handbag, leaving the disturbed earth as it was. There was no need to alert the village just yet. No need to draw suspicion where answers were still shadows. Later that afternoon, she took tea with Reverend Pierce at the vicarage. Clara was not present, off resting, he said, at the doctor's suggestion. She had been prone to headaches, and with the recent tragedy, they had worsened. "She's a delicate girl," he said, pouring tea. "Never quite recovered from her mother's death, and now this." Hugh was, well, not everything she hoped for, but she was loyal. Miss Marple nodded, stirring her tea without drinking. "Did you know he intended to leave?" Pierce looked up, startled. "Leave?" "Yes." "Not the village, just the engagement. There's a passage in his notebook." She tapped her handbag. "He wrote that he wished to spare her the pain, but couldn't continue the lie. He spoke of a reckoning." The Reverend sighed heavily. "No, I hadn't heard. But I can't say I'm entirely surprised." Clara seemed confused lately, even withdrawn. And Hugh, well, his attentions had grown rather distracted. "Do you know by whom?" she asked delicately. Pierce hesitated. "Lady Agnes, perhaps. Or Miss Everleigh. Or even—" He stopped. "Yes." He shook his head. "Forgive me, I shouldn't speculate." But Miss Marple read it in his eyes. There had been another woman, and it wasn't one the village would approve of. That evening, in the hush of twilight, Miss Marple visited Clara. The young woman answered the door with visible weariness, her cheeks pale and eyes dulled. "I can't offer tea," she said. The kettle broke, and I've not had the will to fix it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I haven't come for tea, dear. Only to return something of yours." She drew the small box from her handbag and offered it. Clara opened it slowly. When she saw the brooch, her fingers trembled. Where did you—" "It was behind the old rose bed, near the summer-house," Miss Marple said softly. "Buried quite shallowly." Clara stared at it, mouth slightly open. "But I lost it weeks ago. I thought I'd dropped it near the vicarage." "No," Miss Marple said. "It was placed there. Hidden." There was a long silence. "I didn't even realize it was missing until the day before the party," Clara said finally, clutching the box. "I only noticed when I went to wear it with my shawl. It must have broken before it was taken." Miss Marple watched her closely. "Then someone else wanted it, or wanted you to be without it." Clara looked up, alarmed. "But why?" Miss Marple gave her hand a gentle pat. "That, my dear, is what I intend to discover." As the moon rose once more over Lower Ivycombe, casting long shadows across rose beds and gravestones, Miss Marple sat at her desk, her lamp glowing steady. She had, she felt, enough pieces to glimpse the shape of the puzzle. A broken brooch. A hidden journal. A truth spoken too late. But there was still one whisper she hadn't heard yet. And the ivy was beginning to rustle again. The next morning dawned cloudless, an unusually crisp light cutting through the village's lingering haze of suspicion. But inside the ivy-covered walls of the Lower Ivycombe police station, things remained dark. Sergeant Thompson stood at his desk, rubbing his temples with the weariness of a man caught between public pressure and private uncertainty. In front of him, seated awkwardly in one of the hard wooden chairs, was Julian Tibbs. "Again." "I didn't kill him," Tibbs said for the second time that hour, voice tight. "And if you're suggesting otherwise—" "No one's suggesting anything," Thompson cut in, though his tone lacked conviction. "We're just trying to piece together the facts." "And what facts do you have?" Tibbs snapped. "That I argued with Hugh. That I had reason to resent him. That I found his notebook." He lowered his voice. "Yes, I read it. But it made no sense. Half-truths and speculation. Nothing worth killing over." Thompson tapped a pencil against the blotter. "The truth is, Mr. Tibbs, you had a motive. And with Miss Marple's recent discovery—" "The brooch." "Exactly. Hidden behind the summer-house, on land you've been seen near more than once." Tibbs's fists clenched. "I was trying to keep Clara safe. That's all I've ever done." Thompson paused. "Safe from what?" Tibbs hesitated, too long. Before he could answer, the station door creaked open. "Good morning," came the calm, well-measured voice of Miss Marple. She stepped in, umbrella in hand and a slight smile on her lips. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." Thompson, though unused to being interrupted during questioning, found himself oddly relieved by Miss Marple's arrival. She had a curious way of making even the worst of situations feel like something that might be solved over tea and seed cake. "I came," she said, "because I believe Mr. Tibbs may have some truths he's not quite ready to admit. And I quite understand. It's terribly hard, isn't it, to be misunderstood in a small place like ours?" Tibbs looked away. Miss Marple continued gently, "But sometimes the weight of secrecy does more harm than good, especially when it's protecting someone who may no longer need protection." She set her handbag down on the edge of the desk. "There's something I'd like to ask you, Mr. Tibbs. Not as an accusation, but as a neighbor." He glanced up, brow furrowed. "What is it? Was Clara ever afraid of Hugh?" The room went very still. Sergeant Thompson blinked. Tibbs swallowed. "She wouldn't have said so." "That's not what I asked." He exhaled. "Yes," he said finally. "She was. She never used the word, but I could see it. Something changed in her this past month." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And you thought she might have done something foolish?" "She wouldn't," he said quickly. "But I didn't want the village turning on her if they knew about the argument." Thompson leaned forward. "What argument?" Tibbs hesitated again. "Hugh confronted her 3 days before the garden party. He said he'd uncovered something about her mother's death. That it hadn't been an accident after all. Thompson raised an eyebrow. And what did he mean by that? I don't know, Tibbs said. Clara wouldn't speak of it. But she looked haunted. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. And that, perhaps, is the real secret. Not who killed Mr. Grinstead, but what he uncovered that led to his death. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage once again. This time, she found Clara sitting alone on the back bench of the churchyard, her face turned to the late autumn sun. Her hands were clasped tightly together in her lap. Miss Marple joined her without a word. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Clara spoke. "He found the coroner's letter." Miss Marple turned. "Pardon, Hugh," she said. "He'd gone digging through my mother's old things. I told him not to. But he always said he hated untold stories. He found a letter addressed to the parish priest. My mother never sent it. She looked down. She wrote that she was afraid. That someone had been following her. Watching her from the orchard. She feared she was being poisoned." Miss Marple absorbed this without visible reaction. "And was she?" Clara's lips parted. "I don't know. She died in her sleep. They said it was her heart. But you think otherwise?" Clara's eyes shimmered. "I don't know what to think. But Hugh said he'd take it to the police after the garden party. He said I deserved to know the truth." Miss Marple laid a hand gently over Clara's. "And someone didn't want him to." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and sat by her writing desk, reviewing the facts. A hidden brooch. A vanished letter. A journal filled with confessions and half-truths. A young woman afraid. A man who knew too much. And through it all, the image of the moonlit garden, where the roses no longer bloomed for beauty, but for concealment. She closed her notebook softly. One piece still didn't fit. One whisper still hadn't spoken. But the wind had changed. And someone was about to make a mistake. It was nearing dusk when Miss Marple returned once more to the edge of Marchwood Orchard. The air was heavy with that peculiar quiet only villages can know, a stillness between conversations, between thoughts, as though the land itself was holding its breath. She brought no umbrella this time, no handbag cluttered with careful tools. Only a small lantern and a folded sheet of paper tucked into her sleeve. The ground behind the rose bed was dry now, the soil beginning to crack under the changing season. Miss Marple did not kneel, she merely stood, light raised, examining the area with sharp, bird-like eyes. Ivy had begun to creep back toward the place where the brooch had been buried. A second disturbance caught her attention. Just 3 feet further along, where the brambles met the stone wall, was a neat patch of overturned earth. Not clumsy like the brooch's hiding place, this was precise. Recent. Deliberate. Miss Marple did not touch it. She did not need to. Instead, she made her way quietly toward the vicarage. The Reverend Pierce was not at home. Clara answered the door again, her hair loose and her eyes still rimmed with tiredness. She looked more herself than before. There was a steadiness returning to her. "I have a question," Miss Marple said, "about your mother." Clara stepped back, letting her in. "You think it was connected, don't you?" "I do," Miss Marple replied. "And I believe Mr. Grinstead came to the same conclusion. He wasn't merely concerned about his engagement. He was frightened. Not for himself, but for what might happen to you if the truth stayed buried." Clara looked down at her hands. "I have something you should read," Miss Marple said. From her sleeve, she produced the folded letter. Clara opened it carefully. The parchment was thin, the ink faded in places, but still legible. The letter her mother had written to the parish priest but never sent. The words trembled from the page. "There is something growing inside me that does not belong to nature. I taste bitterness in my tea and wake with shadows I cannot place. I hear the creak of the stairs at night. If anything happens to me, please look to the orchard. The roses know more than they show." Clara's fingers curled tightly around the edge of the page. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Who would do such a thing to her?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "I believe it is someone who still lives among us." That night, in the snug drawing-room of St. Mary Mead Cottage, Miss Marple had two visitors. Sergeant Thompson arrived first, bearing with him the expected air of weariness but also, now, a touch of grudging respect. "You've always got a sense for these things, Miss Marple," he said, accepting her offer of weak tea. "And truth be told, we've been chasing shadows. I don't know what we're looking for any more." Miss Marple smiled politely. "That's because you've been looking at the facts, Sergeant, and not the people." He blinked. "What d'you mean?" "Facts are tidy," she said. "But people, oh, people are never so accommodating." Before he could reply, the doorbell rang a second time. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That, I believe, will be our shadow." Standing in the doorway, face pale as the moonlight behind her, was Agnes Everleigh. She was dressed in a fine walking coat, her hair pinned precisely, and her gloved hands were trembling. I need to speak with you, Miss Marple," she said. "It's urgent." Miss Marple ushered her in without comment. Thompson stood to the side, watching. Agnes took a deep breath, then said with painful precision, "You think I had something to do with Hugh's death?" Miss Marple didn't deny it. Instead, she said softly, "I think you were close to him, Miss Everleigh. Much closer than Clara ever knew." Agnes flinched. "We were friends. But you wished to be more. Didn't you?" Silence. A long one. "Yes," she whispered. "But he wouldn't. He said he couldn't betray Clara." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "And did that rejection drive you to protect her in your own way?" Agnes looked up, startled. "Protect her?" Miss Marple nodded. "The orchard, Miss Everleigh. The place you always said was your refuge. But it wasn't just yours. Clara's mother loved it too, didn't she?" Agnes's lips parted. "You were the last to see Mrs. Pierce alive," Miss Marple continued. "The vicar never said as much, but Clara told me once that you brought roses to the funeral. From the orchard." Agnes turned away. "I didn't hurt her," she said quickly. "I never meant for her to." "To what?" Miss Marple asked softly. Agnes's hands trembled again. She was going to leave. She was going to take Clara and vanish. She said the village was poison. She was right. Her voice cracked. "But I thought if she stayed, if she saw that we still cared." Miss Marple said nothing. "She drank the tea," Agnes whispered. "I made it for her, but I didn't know he'd already." She stopped. Thompson stepped forward. "Who?" Agnes looked at him. Then she said one name, and everything changed. The room fell into a thick, unnatural stillness. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees that edged Marchwood Orchard. The roses, those silent keepers of so many secrets, swayed gently in the darkness. Inside Miss Marple's parlour, all eyes turned toward Agnes Everleigh, who had at last spoken the name. "Reverend Pierce," she whispered, as though afraid the words might summon him. "It was him. It's always been him." Sergeant Thompson, to his credit, recovered first. "The vicar," he said in disbelief. "But why? What possible reason would he have to?" Agnes shook her head. "You don't know him. None of you ever did. That gentle voice, that perfect posture. But he could be cruel. Quietly, always quietly, but cruel all the same." Miss Marple did not look surprised. "Tell us everything, my dear," she said gently. Agnes took a breath, like a swimmer before a plunge. "It began with Clara's mother, Eleanor. She was vibrant, beautiful. But she didn't belong here, and he knew it. She'd come from London, full of ideas, questions, friends who visited and laughed too loudly. She made him feel small. He never said it aloud, but I saw it in the way he looked at her." "And so he poisoned her?" Thompson asked, incredulous. Agnes flinched. "Not at first. At first, he simply tried to control her. He forbade her from seeing certain friends, discouraged her from writing letters. When that didn't work, the whispers began, about her nerves, her health. And then, her medicine changed. Small doses. Nothing traceable." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Until she became ill." Agnes nodded. By the time she realized something was wrong, It was too late. I think she guessed, in the end. That's why she wrote that letter. Thompson stood, pacing now, his hands behind his back. And Hugh Grinstead discovered this? Yes, Agnes said. He was researching the family, tracing old correspondence for his memoir project. He found Eleanor's diary tucked inside a hollow book in the vicarage library. She had kept notes, on her symptoms, on her fears. And she mentioned the tea. Thompson turned to Miss Marple. And the poison? Miss Marple nodded. Belladonna, I should think. In small doses, quite easy to miss in an otherwise mild herbal blend. And in the vicarage garden, no doubt growing quite innocently in one of the flower beds. Agnes swallowed. Hugh told me 2 days before the garden party. Said he had confronted the vicar. Reverend Pierce laughed. Said no one would believe a man writing a book of gossip. He said if Hugh pushed further, people would begin to suspect him, the outsider with no ties, no past. Thompson muttered a curse under his breath. And so he killed him. Agnes's voice cracked. I don't know how. But Hugh didn't drink. And yet he had liquor in his system. I think, she hesitated, I think the vicar offered him a peace offering. A drink in the summer house. It would have seemed like a reconciliation. Miss Marple closed her eyes. And within the hour, he was dead. Belladonna again, enough to stop the heart. A silence fell over the room. Then Miss Marple opened her eyes again, sharp and bright as morning light. There is one last thing, she said. The grave. Thompson blinked. What grave? The patch of earth behind the rosebed, she said. Agnes, you told me once that Eleanor's favorite roses were moved after her death. I went to the vicarage this morning. The rosebed was still warm beneath the soil. Thompson stared at her. You think he buried something there? I think, Miss Marple said, he buried the diary. By dawn, the garden had yielded its final secret. Wrapped in oilskin cloth and bound with twine, Eleanor Pierce's diary emerged from the damp earth like a voice from beyond. Her final entries were damning, not just suspicions, but certainty. She'd written, "He won't stop until I'm silent." Thompson looked visibly shaken. "We'll bring him in immediately." But when they reached the vicarage, Reverend Pierce was gone. A note, in his precise, elegant hand, rested on the mantel. "I've done what I believed was righteous. But righteousness, it seems, has turned against me. Tell Clara. I did love her mother. In my way." They found him in the bell tower. He had not flung himself from it. No, his final act was quieter, darker, poison in his own tea, brewed from the same leaves that had taken Eleanor and Hugh. The bells tolled once as he fell. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat alone in the hush that follows a storm. Clara would heal in time. The vicarage would welcome a new occupant. The village, as villages always do, would move on, slower than before, perhaps more watchful, but forward all the same. And in the orchard, the roses would bloom again. But this time, someone would always remember. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke in slow ripples after the storm. News had spread, as it always did, first in whispers, then in sudden outbursts of disbelief and teacup-clattering revelations. By noon, everyone knew that the Reverend Pierce had taken his own life in the bell tower of his church, and that Hugh Grinstead's death had not been the accident it had seemed. The diary of Eleanor Pierce, discovered buried beneath the rosebed, now lay safely locked in a drawer at Scotland Yard, but its words had already shaken the parish to its core. What was hardest to reconcile, many said, was the notion that a man of such quiet conviction, who had presided over christenings, funerals, and harvest blessings, could harbor such darkness behind the folds of his cassock. But human nature, as Miss Marple often reminded her friends at the Tuesday knitting circle, is not tidy. It is not kind, nor cruel, but complex, and above all, it rarely conforms to appearances. Clara Pierce had retreated to a cousin's cottage in Devon for the time being. Her departure had been quick and quiet, her farewell to Miss Marple filled with gratitude and a trembling sort of strength. "I don't know what to do next," she had said, her fingers laced tightly together. "Everything I thought was real wasn't." Miss Marple had patted her hand gently. "My dear, you must plant new roots. But do let them rest a little first." On the morning following the vicar's funeral, an austere, sparsely attended affair, Miss Marple took a solitary walk to Marchwood Orchard. The roses had not been touched. No one dared. But they bloomed anyway, as if indifferent to the sorrows they'd witnessed. She stood a moment, admiring their stubborn beauty. It was not lost on her, this strange balance of tragedy and renewal. The very bed that had hidden Eleanor's words had once hidden Hugh's brooch, a token of love and guilt. Beneath petals and thorns, secrets had waited patiently for someone to look closely enough. Miss Marple had done just that. Not with a policeman's authority or a barrister's logic, but with the quiet eyes of a woman who had spent her life watching people forget they were being watched. Who understood that a tremor in a teacup, or a glance over one's shoulder, could reveal far more than fingerprints or footprints ever could. That evening, back in her parlor, Miss Marple sat beside the fire, her knitting basket by her side. The cat, a ginger fellow from next door who'd taken to visiting, curled lazily at her feet. Sergeant Thompson had called earlier that day to deliver his thanks. There would be no public commendation, of course, not for an old woman with a penchant for lace collars and rose-hip tea. But he'd shaken her hand with sincere warmth. "You were right all along," he'd said. "It wasn't about evidence. It was about people." Miss Marple had smiled. "Quite so, Sergeant. People always tell you what they are. You need only listen." The clock chimed 8. Outside, the bells of St. Mary Mead Church remained silent. But in the orchard, the breeze stirred the roses, and somewhere among the leaves, a petal fell softly to the soil, an offering, perhaps. Or a reminder. Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles once more. "Now then," she murmured to herself, "where was I? Ah, yes, cable ribbing." And the world, for all its wickedness and wonder, continued to turn.